All right, hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word, verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we get into our study, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, book by book. We are in 2 Timothy, and we are we're in chapter 4, and a couple of things I do want to cover with what I think is a very powerful passage. Paul, now think about this, Paul knowing that his execution was near, knowing he's going to die. This letter kind of brings us face to face with our mortality, but even beyond that, in other words, if you knew you were going to die, right, what would your thoughts be? If you knew you were going to pass away, if you knew, what would you be thinking about? And I can remember doing hospital visitations with people, and it was amazing the different reactions that people knew they were going to die, what they were thinking about. And you also, and I think this is God granting you to have this, to see this. I remember being in some of the most picturesque neighborhoods where, for me, I'm thinking how wonderful it would be to live here. The house, the neighborhood, just everything picturesque. And then I thought about the person who was sick, that none of that mattered to them, that they were dying. So all of that picturesque, maybe the clothes and the closet, the jewelry and the pictures, the memories, at that point, you think about, what did all of that matter to them? And I one of my deepest prayers, my main prayers that I pray, and you can even say the prayer of faith, right? That I pray is, Lord, that when my time comes to die, and only you know that, my prayer is I could say I finished what you have given me to do. Okay, because at that point, nothing else matters. If you are the richest person, right? You're the richest person, which means you have traveled, you have bought everything, you could probably you have done everything that your money could afford you. At the point of your death, what does it matter? Now, so the reason why when we get into this, let me get down to our verse, and we talked about this. The time will come, verse 3, when they will not tolerate sound doctrine, but according to their own desires will multiply teachers for themselves, because they have an itch to hear something new. And they will turn away from hearing the truth and will turn aside to myth. So we're living in these kinds of times, where people are doing just that, right? There are churches that are, again, they are crafted for that. You could say there are churches that are they're on purpose. However it is that they have crafted. We're not going to be heavy in politics. We're not going to be even heavy in preaching sin and anything controversial. In other words, we're going to always preach soothing messages, positive message, right? Encouraging messages. Never anything confrontational, right? Now, of course, that's unbiblical, because if the need arises, now you can go to the other extreme. There's no reason to be confrontational if there's no reason to be confrontational. But you certainly shouldn't avoid critical issues. So he says, again, by the way, for those of you, we are in Second Timothy chapter 4, and Yeet. How you doing, brother? It says, I believe in God because I prayed to Him that I would win a. Okay. Well, alrighty. That's your faith there, brother. Poor faith, but okay. All right. So he says, verse 4, he says, they will turn away from hearing the truth and turn aside to myths. Now, verse 5, he says, but as for you, be serious about everything. Endure hardships. Do the work of an evangelist. Fulfill your ministry. Now, if you remember, this is not the first time he had been telling Timothy this from the first epistle, right? Stir up the gift. Keep your gift going. Don't shrink away from your gift. And now he says, notice this, fulfill your ministry. Now, kind of interesting. He says, but if you be serious about everything, and then endure hardships. Now, if you remember, he already told Timothy to endure hardships by the grace of God. Be strong in the grace of God. Okay? And then he says, do the work of an evangelist. Interesting that he tells Timothy that. Timothy kind of gives the insight how we define sometimes the ministry gifts. Now, there are 5 ministry gifts. Actually, there are more. Ephesians record 5 because he was that was Paul's focus at that point. And then when you get over into 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and Romans chapter 12, you see other gifts listed. And these gifts are gifts of grace. They enable you, they empower you to do what God has called you to do. So one of the ways you could tell if you're called to something is, what is your area of gifting? What have you been gifted in? Okay. So he says, do the work of an evangelist. And an evangelist was one who goes and he preaches. An evangelist, let me just say this. Some of you come, and we may call some of the old school churches, the old Pentecostal churches, the old holiness churches. I was always amazed when sometimes you would go in these churches and basically you had just, one person might have been, they would always introduce someone as either missionary or an evangelist. And have no problem with that. The problem that I do say is they never did any evangelistic work. If all your title does is, you sit in the pulpit and either I'm an elder, bishop, minister, evangelist, or missionary, these are verbs, not nouns only, okay? And notice he says, do the work. He tells Timothy to do the work of an evangelist. So every work of God, think about this, should involve some type of evangelistic work. He's telling Timothy here to do the work of evangelist. And then he says, fulfill your ministry. So again, he's telling Timothy that don't shrink away, okay, from what God is calling you. And remember, throughout this book, he's been telling Timothy that don't shrink away. Don't shrink away from what God has called you. Don't be timid in what God has called you. Timothy had those tendencies that you could probably say he was a nice guy. So if he came to the church, he was a younger man. Don't shrink away because of the position that God has put you in. And, so notice that again, fulfill your ministry. Now, verse 6 says, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time for my departure is close. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. There is reserved for me in the future a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, and not only to me, but to all those who love his appearing." And this is an astounding statement, as I said, that knowing, there was a couple of astounding things here about Timothy. Knowing that he was going to die. First, about Paul, knowing that he was going to be executed. He didn't express remorse of what he didn't do. I didn't take that vacation. I didn't get that cruise. I never got a chance to buy my dream house and yada, 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 right? His concern was Timothy. His concern was he wanted to strengthen Timothy. And, we read in Peter the same thing when Peter says, "I know I must put off this tent, so I want you guys to have these truths." That's what they were thinking about. And so this is an astounding scripture here. Now, in verse 6, he says, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering. And this signifies, basically, he's saying, hey, it's going to happen. If we were living in our times, you would say they have an execution date. All the appeals have been exhausted. It's going to happen. But he wasn't even worried about that. He wasn't cowering from that. He says, "I fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith." And that's why I said the one prayer that I have. This is the prayer that I have. And when I pray, "Lord, keep me healthy. Lord, give me long life." All that is always prayed with the perspective that, Lord, I want to be able to say, "I finished your work. What you have assigned me to do, I finished it." And now, as Paul, as he is standing right on the edge of crossing over, he's able to say, "I've finished. I've done what God wanted me to do. I've completed his work." That's astounding. And to be able to take that, and I want to go to Hebrews because I want to show you something about and the reason why I want to read this in Hebrews, and I want to show you these are the Old Testament saints, and there was something astounding about them. This is Hebrews 11, chapter 1. It says, "Now faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. For our ancestors won God's approval by it. By faith we understand the universe was created by God's command, so that what is seen has not been made from the things that are visible. By faith Abel offered to God." Now I want you to kind of look at some of these statements. I'm going to read through, but what is most interesting is what was noticeable about them, that by faith they had completed God's purpose for their life. And you will note in some cases that the purpose wasn't great. In other words, they didn't have a long list of things that they said, accomplishments that they did. What was noteworthy is they completed God's purposes, and they did it in faith. So he says, by faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was approved as the righteous man because God approved his gifts. And even though he is dead, he still speaks through his faith. And what is, again, interesting about Abel is the two difference between Cain and Abel. Cain offered God what God, Abel offered God what God wanted. Cain offered God what Cain wanted, and God rejected Cain's offering. Verse 5 says, by faith Enoch was taken away, so he did not experience death, and he was not to be found because God took him away. For prior to his removal, he was approved since he had pleased God. And of course, Enoch becomes one of the types of the New Testament. What is interesting about Enoch is that when you go back and you read Genesis and you see all of these long lifespans, right? 900, 800, 700. Enoch only lived about 300 years, and then he was taken away. Okay, he was actually almost the same word for rapture. He was snatched away. Verse 6. Now, without faith, it is impossible to please God. For the one who draws near to him must believe that he exists and rewards those that seek him. By faith, Noah, after he was warned about what was not yet seen, and motivated by godly fear, built an ark to deliver his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which comes by faith. By faith. Now think about Noah, right? That he builds it. It took him about 120 years. And think about that he builds this ark, and it could be very interesting to think, well, what were people thinking about at that time? Like, Noah, what you doing? Building a boat. Building a boat, why? It's going to rain. What is rain? It's kind of interesting. What is rain? The Bible tells us you really didn't have a rainfall, that the earth was sort of watered by an irrigation system. But notice he did that. That was his purpose, to build the ark. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed and went out to a place where he was going to receive as an inheritance. He went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he stayed as a foreigner in the land of promise, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, co-heirs of the same promise. Excuse me. For he was looking for a city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself, when she was unable to have children, received power to conceive offsprings, and even though she was past the age, since she considered the one who had promised was faithful. Therefore, from one man, in fact, from one as good as dead, came offspring as numerous as the stars of the heaven, as innumerable as the grain of sand by the sea shore. Now, Abraham, and I think pretty much everybody in Christendom knows the story of Abraham. He was old when God appeared to him. I think it was 75 when God even appeared to him. Sarah was about 10 years younger. But Sarah never could have children. God says, you're going to have a children from Sarah. Okay. And he believed God. And I'm going to show you how strong his faith was in a minute. But he believed God. He actually believed God. And his faith was so strong in God. Let's see. Verse 13 says, these all died in faith without having received the promise, but saw them from a distance, greeted them, and confessed that they were foreigners and temporary residents in the earth. Now, they that say such things make it clear that they are seeking a homeland, if they were thinking about where they came from, and notice this, if they were thinking about where they came from, they would have opportunity to return. But they now desire a better place, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared for them a city. Now, this is what is interesting about this statement here. What is interesting about this statement? Notice they died in faith, not having received the promise, meaning of salvation in Jesus to come. That's what's astounding about this list of witnesses here that the writer of Hebrews is giving. Abraham, it was revealed to them that Christ was coming, and thus they lived their life. In other words, they altered their plans, whatever their plans would be. And yes, some of them lived very good lives. Abraham was wealthy. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was wealthy. But they altered whatever plans that they had with the focus. And you see that if you go back and you read the Genesis account. For example, one of the things that you see that when it came time for Isaac to be married, and Abraham was so emphatically clear, you do not choose a wife from the Canaanites. Right? And that was in keeping with the covenant, with the promise that God had said He was going to have, that He was going to receive. Verse 17, and this is very interesting. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He received the promise, and he received the promise, and he was offering his unique son, the one it had been said about, your seed would be traced. Now, notice this statement because this is very important. He said your seed would be traced through Isaac. He considered God able even to raise someone from the dead. As an illustration, he received them back. Now, here's the interesting thing about Abraham, that when God told him to offer his son, Abraham's focus was, but this is the son you promised. So in obedience to God, in faith to God, he said, fine, I'll offer him. Kill him, burn him, but you have to raise him from the dead. That heap of ashes, you would have to raise him from the dead. Now here's my point. All of them, what's the testimony about them is that they're focused on what God had called them to do. And in each of those cases, they had fulfilled what God had called them to do. And that's why it says that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him for righteousness. These, when it says died in faith, and in faith being the ultimate word there, that they died in faith, it was credited to them for righteousness. In other words, they have, at the time, think about it, Abraham, probably, if you wanted to put a number of years, around 2,000 years maybe. It could be anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 years before Christ. So he died in faith. He died in faith, waiting 1,500 years just for Jesus to come, to be born. And it's been 2,000 years since Jesus is born, so they're still waiting for their new bodies. They died in faith. So I want to go, one other thing, however, let me go back and read this because I find this, again, very astounding here. Verse 6, again, this is 2 Timothy chapter 4, and verse 6, it says, I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time of my departure is close. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. There is reserved for me a future, a crown, the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day. And not only me, but all those that love his appearing. You know, one of the things that I have to say, let's ask the question, what is it that you think you're going to take with you? Sometimes we wrestle about a lot of things, fight about a lot of things, get angst over a lot of things, right? Fret over a lot of things. But think about this. What are you going to take? Paul said, I got a crown waiting for me. And again, I remember I told you that picturesque neighborhood. I would see these different people who had this picturesque neighborhood. And what was most interesting about that at the time of their death, when they're sick, you think about even today, one of the most heartbreaking things about people that die of COVID, okay, that they die in isolation. Their families can't be around their bedside. That's the protocol. And it's heartbreaking. So if you were to face that, I'm thinking about one particular guy who was, you know, in a sense bragging about he was a millionaire, and he certainly was. He leaned a particular political way, caught COVID-19. In fact, this guy even ran for president. He caught COVID-19 and died. And I thought about that. Here's a millionaire died. So what did all of that matter? I want to read something, and this is the love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter. Many of us know this, but one of the things about this, it spilled water on me. One of the things about this chapter is we interpret this chapter from a perspective. We interpret this chapter from a perspective of, if I love, okay? In other words, if I show you love, in accordance with this chapter, if I show you love, then I'm going to win you, okay? So a lot of us think that. A lot of us think if I do that, that I'm going to win people by that. And we should love, however, that is not necessarily going to win people because you show an act of love, an act of kindness. It could actually fuel even more hatred, by the way. But here's my point. So the idea is that this is not what this chapter is talking about. So I want to read through this, but I want you to pay attention again to what he is focusing on. So this is again 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 1 says, if I speak human or angelic languages, but do not have love, I am a sounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so that I can move mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. If I donate all my goods to feed the poor, and if I give my body in order to boast but do not have love, I gain nothing. Now, what is interesting, of course, the subject of love, but notice how many times I appear in this chapter, right? Notice how many times I. And so why I say that is because oftentimes people will say, or they interpret this chapter as the formula for winning people if I love them. And that's not what Paul is talking about. The focus of this chapter if you will note, is I, right? I. Look how many times I put in there. If I speak in angelic love, I am a sounding gong. If I have the gift of prophecy, right? Notice that if I have all knowledge, so that I can remove mountains. I am nothing. If I donate my body, if I give my body to the burn, if I gain nothing. Now, the point is, in this chapter, my, appears some, depending on the translations, I think 28 times, I think, depending on the translation. The focus is on you. The focus is on me. The focus is on I, the reader of this. And so you put yourself in this position and says, if I do all these things. And what is interesting is that, remember, all of these things are good. Not one of the things that he said here is not good. In other words, not one of the things he says is not good. Right? If I think the minister that was speaking in the angelic languages, I wanted for prayer didn't work because she didn't have love. Okay. All right. I couldn't help that one. I couldn't help that one. But anyway. But notice all of those things though, they're good. But let me go on. Let's go on and read. So verse 4 says, love is patient. Love is kind. Now remember, you just got through saying, if I do all of these good deeds, these good acts, these good works, but I don't have love, right? If I don't love, he says, I am nothing, right? So then he says, verse 4, love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy, love is not boastful, is not conceited, does not act improperly, is not selfish, is not provoked, and does not keep a record of wrongs. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but rejoice in truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. But notice the statement, love never ends. Now notice that statement. What does he mean, love never ends? Now if you read the Old King James, it says, excuse me, love never fails. And again, people interpret that as that if I act as do an act of love towards you, then love will never fail. Well, the truth of the matter is love fails all the time under that principle. Just think about this. The first, second, and third centuries, love failed a lot because Christians were slaughtered by the thousands, martyred by the thousands. In other words, the point is, Paul is not talking about that. And Paul is not saying that if you love people, you're going to win them. Yeah, you're going to win some, but you're not going to win all. But when he says love never ends or love never fails, fails who? Me. Now, let's put this in. So love never fails me. So that's what he's been talking about in all of these, right? In this whole chapter. If I speak in angelic tongues, if I have the gift of prophecy, if I have the word of knowledge, if I give my body to be burned, if I, sacrifice and give and all that kind of stuff, but if I don't have love, I'm nothing. All of these things don't mean anything. But then he gets down to this verse, he says, love never fails, but it never fails who? Me. Now let's go back to Paul. Let's take the same words and apply them to Paul. Paul says, verse 6, 2 Timothy chapter 4, hey Pastor Ty, good to see you, brother. But he said, verse 6, he says, I am ready to be poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is close. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now notice this. There is reserved for me in the future a crown of righteousness. So now let's apply these same words to Paul. Right? Love never fails him. Hey, Pastor Tom, I'm gonna throw out this. Just think about, right, those last days with Pastor Cheryl, right? What did she take into glory, right? Look at the life work, the people she touched, the sacrifices, right? And in the end, when she was immobile, right, what was she able to take into eternity? And that's what Paul is talking about right here. Paul was in jail, waiting to be executed. And yet he's still giving out. He was still giving out, strengthening Timothy. That he was able to take into eternity. See, he was able to take that into eternity. That life of love. And then those things that he did in love, that's what's going to be waiting for him. Like, think about all the people. And by now, of course, with Paul, and actually, I'll take that back. Paul is still, his work is still touching people's lives, right? We're reading his letters. And just think about all of the people, the millions of people over the last 2,000 years. We're reading his letters, growing in faith because he was faithful to God. Okay? Now, I'm not saying all of us, of course, all of us are not going to have such a grandiose ministry. Paul himself probably at the time didn't fathom the reach. But think about it. We're still benefiting. And I would see people when I would do my hospital visitation. But I'm thinking about one particular lady where she was dying of cancer. And one of the most amazing things that I saw was how she touched people. Laying in the bed, immobile, that she would touch people to the extent people they would come on their breaks and spend time with her. They would sit with her on her breaks and come before and after her shift. See, that's what I'm saying. We don't need to do a lot. And Paul says here, but he finished his faith and he says, this is waiting for me. And then he says, verse 8 again, there is reserved for me a future and crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day. Not only me, but to all those who love his appearing. All right, guys, we'll pick it up with verse 9 in our next study. And again, my prayer is, Lord, I want to be able to finish the work that you have given me. I want to do that's again, when I say that, that's one of the most heartfelt prayers out of anything else. That prayer supersedes anything, right? That I could pray for, that I could say I want on my bucket list, my whatever. I want to be able to say at the time of my death, just like what Paul says right here, I finished what God has given me to do. And of course, finish it in love, finish it in faith, and finish it in love. All right, guys. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I'll see you in the next study. I see you.